When we look back at the Clone Wars, most people see a galactic civil war with clear sides. The Republic fighting for unity and democracy against the separatists who wanted independence. But what if everything we thought we knew about this conflict was wrong? What if the war that tore the galaxy apart was never meant to be won by either side? The truth is far more sinister than most citizens of the galaxy ever realized. The Clone Wars was not a conflict between two opposing forces with different ideologies. It was a grand deception orchestrated by the Sith, designed from the beginning to fail in exactly the way it did. The seeds of this deception were planted long before the first shots were fired on Geonosis. While the galaxy saw Count Dooku as a political idealist who left the Jedi Order to lead the separatist movement, his true identity remained hidden. Dooku had become Darth Tyrannus, apprentice to Darth Sidious, and together they crafted the most elaborate trap in galactic history. Think about it. The Separatist alliance was led by Count Dooku, secretly a Sith Lord. The Republic was guided by Supreme Chancellor Palpatine, who was secretly Darth Sidious, the Sith Master. Both sides of this devastating conflict were controlled by the same two individuals. The same dark power pulled all the strings, ensuring the war would unfold exactly as planned. The Republic and the Separatists were nothing more than pawns in this grand scheme. Military strategies, political decisions, victories and defeats were all carefully choreographed to serve the Sith agenda. When Republic forces seemed on the verge of a decisive victory, mysterious intelligence failures would occur. When Separatist armies gained too much ground, their leadership would suddenly make inexplicable tactical errors. This wasn't incompetence or coincidence, it was by design. The Sith Lords wanted a long, devastating war that would drain resources, claim millions of lives, and spread fear across the galaxy. The conflict was never meant to end with a clear victor through military means. It was meant to exhaust both sides until the moment was right for something far worse. For the Jedi, the Clone Wars became the perfect trap. These guardians of peace who had spent 1,000 generations as negotiators and peacekeepers were thrust into roles as military generals. The very nature of their order was compromised as they led armies into battle, made military decisions that cost lives, and became entangled in political machinations. Consider how perfectly this served the Sith plan. The Jedi were drawn away from their temple, scattered across the galaxy leading clone armies. Their connection to the Force became clouded by the violence and suffering of war. Their ranks thinned as more Jedi fell in battle. And most importantly, public perception of them transformed from respected peacekeepers to military commanders associated with a failing war effort. The clone army itself represents perhaps the most brilliant aspect of the Sith deception. Most citizens of the Republic believed the clone army appeared at exactly the right moment to save the Republic. A fortunate coincidence. In reality, the clone army was commissioned in secret by the Sith years before the conflict began. These clone troopers were engineered for complete loyalty and programmed with special protocols, including the infamous Order 66. This order, embedded in the minds of every clone through inhibitor chips, would instantly transform them from loyal protectors into executioners of their Jedi generals. The Jedi literally led their own assassins into battle for years without ever suspecting the danger. As the war dragged on, fear spread throughout the galaxy. Systems that had known peace for generations became battlegrounds. Trade routes were disrupted, causing food shortages on many worlds. Refugees fled conflict zones by the billions. The average citizen began to care less about abstract concepts like democracy and freedom, and more about basic security and stability. This atmosphere of fear and chaos created the perfect conditions for Chancellor Palpatine to accumulate power. With each new crisis, the Senate willingly granted him additional emergency powers. Constitutional safeguards were suspended in the name of security. Executive orders replaced legislative debate. Step by step, the Republic transformed into an autocracy, and the citizens welcomed it. What makes this deception so brilliant is that it all happened legally. There was no coup, no violent overthrow of the government. The Republic voted away its own freedom, applauding as it did so. The transition from Republic to Empire happened with overwhelming public support because a war-weary galaxy was willing to trade liberty for the promise of peace and order. Meanwhile, the use of droids and clones as the primary combatants served another sinister purpose. By keeping the majority of planetary populations out of direct combat, the Sith could control the narrative of the war. Citizens experienced the conflict through news holos and propaganda rather than personal experience. The war felt simultaneously distant and threatening, the perfect combination to manipulate public opinion. The battles between Republic and Separatist forces also provided invaluable military data. Every engagement, every tactical maneuver, every weapon system tested was analyzed by Sith intelligence. This battlefield laboratory allowed them to refine military doctrine and technology, developing the foundation for what would become the Imperial war machine. Consider the major players in this conflict. General Grievous, the feared Separatist military leader, was controlled directly by Count Dooku. The banking clan, the Trade Federation, the Techno Union, all these powerful entities that supported the Separatist cause had been manipulated into their positions by Darth Sidious through a complex web of financial entanglements and political pressure. On the Republic side, the Jedi Council found itself increasingly under the influence of Chancellor Palpatine. Key military decisions, resource allocations, even the assignments of Jedi to specific battlefronts were subtly guided by Palpatine. The Supreme Chancellor positioned himself as a friend and ally to the Jedi, while systematically undermining their authority and setting them up for their eventual fall. The Clone Wars represents the culmination of a Sith plot 1,000 years in the making. Since the time of Darth Bane, the Sith had operated in secret, passing knowledge from master to apprentice, patiently waiting for the perfect moment to enact their revenge against the Jedi and reclaim control of the galaxy. Under Darth Sidious, that moment finally arrived. What appeared to be a conflict about political independence was actually the final stage of a plan to exterminate the Jedi, end the Republic, and establish Sith rule across the galaxy. The true genius of the plan lies in its inevitability. Once the war began, the end result was virtually guaranteed. The longer the conflict continued, the more power Palpatine accumulated, the more stretched and vulnerable the Jedi became, and the more desperate the citizens grew for any resolution, no matter the cost. When Order 66 was finally executed and Chancellor Palpatine declared himself Emperor, it wasn't just the end of the Clone Wars. It was the completion of a plan set in motion decades earlier. The war had never been meant to be won by either side. It had always been designed to create the conditions necessary for the rise of the Empire and the return of Sith dominance. This is why the Clone Wars were meant to fail. Not because either side lacked the military capability to achieve victory, but because victory through conventional means was never the objective. The true victory had already been determined before the first clone trooper ever set foot on a battlefield. And by the time anyone realized the truth, it was far too late. The galaxy had been played for fools in the grandest deception ever orchestrated. A war fought not for territory or ideology, but for the soul of the galaxy itself. For over 1,000 generations, the Jedi Order stood as guardians of peace and justice in the galaxy. Their lightsabers were not weapons of conquest, but tools of defense. Their wisdom was not used to command armies, but to mediate conflicts. Their connection to the Force guided them to protect the innocent and maintain balance. Then came the Clone Wars, and everything changed. The transition happened almost overnight. Jedi who had spent decades training in the arts of negotiation, meditation, and peacekeeping suddenly found themselves with military ranks and battalions under their command. Masters who had taught younglings about patience and harmony were now planning assault strategies and coordinating bombing runs. Padawans who had barely completed their training were thrust into combat zones, leading squads of clone troopers into battle. This fundamental shift in their role was not a minor adjustment, but a complete contradiction of their core philosophy. The Jedi Code emphasized defense, never attack. It taught respect for all life. It valued patience and careful consideration. War demanded aggression, calculated sacrifices, and split-second decisions that cost lives. As the conflict spread across the stars, many Jedi found themselves stationed on distant worlds for months or even years at a time. Their only companions were the clone troopers under their command and the military personnel they worked alongside. Gone were the days of walking among the people they served, understanding their needs, mediating their disputes. The Jedi became figures seen in military briefings or leading charges against separatist strongholds. This physical distance soon created an emotional and spiritual distance as well. The citizens of the Republic no longer saw the Jedi as wise counselors or helpful protectors. They became remote figures associated with war bulletins and casualty reports. When Jedi walked through city streets, they were viewed with a mixture of awe and unease, rather than the respect and trust they once inspired. More troubling than this public perception was what happened to the Jedi themselves. The constant exposure to violence and death took its toll on their connection to the Force. The living Force flows through all life, connecting everything in a delicate balance. War is the antithesis of this balance. It destroys life, creates suffering, and severs connections. Each battle the Jedi fought pulled them further from the very source of their wisdom and power. Young Jedi Knights, who had never known anything but wartime, developed a different understanding of the Force than their predecessors. They learned to use it as a weapon first and a tool for knowledge and defense second. Their training emphasized combat techniques over meditation and philosophical study. An entire generation of Jedi was being shaped by war rather than peace. The moral compromises began small, but grew more significant as the conflict dragged on. Early in the war, Jedi commanders might have hesitated before ordering an assault that would result in civilian casualties. By the third year of fighting, such decisions became routine military calculations. The ends increasingly justified the means, a philosophy entirely at odds with traditional Jedi teaching. Consider how often Jedi found themselves ignoring warning signs from the Force in favor of military objectives. The Force might whisper caution, but the strategic importance of securing a particular planet or destroying a separatist facility would take precedence. Little by little, the Jedi began trusting battlefield intelligence over their instincts. They relied on clone commanders and Republic strategy rather than their connection to the Force. The isolation of the Jedi created another vulnerability that played perfectly into the Sith plan. Surrounded constantly by clone troopers, the Jedi developed bonds of trust and friendship with these soldiers. They fought side by side, saved each other countless times, and mourned fallen comrades together. Not once did most Jedi suspect that these same loyal troops carried within them the programming that would become their execution order. Meanwhile, on the home front, public opinion of the Jedi Order slowly eroded. As the war stretched from months into years, citizens grew weary of the conflict. They questioned why the supposedly powerful Jedi could not bring the fighting to a swift conclusion. Rumors spread that the Jedi were prolonging the war to maintain their newfound military authority. Others whispered that the Order had lost its way, becoming too entangled in politics to serve the true will of the Force. These criticisms held uncomfortable grains of truth. The Jedi had indeed become entangled in Republic politics to an unprecedented degree. Their temple on Coruscant, once a sanctuary of reflection and learning, now functioned partially as a military headquarters. Jedi Council meetings focused more on troop deployments and supply lines than on spiritual guidance or Force philosophy. The Council itself faced mounting internal divisions. Some masters believed they had strayed too far from their traditional role and advocated for stepping back from military leadership. Others argued that their duty to the Republic required full commitment to the war effort. These disagreements created fractures in an institution that had previously operated with remarkable unity of purpose. Perhaps most damaging was the growing perception that the Jedi served as enforcers of Republic policy, rather than independent peacekeepers. When the Republic established a military presence on previously neutral worlds, Jedi commanders often led these forces. When government officials made decisions that benefited core worlds at the expense of the Outer Rim, Jedi were seen standing beside them. The distinction between the Jedi Order and the Republic government blurred in the public mind. This association had devastating consequences for Jedi credibility among populations with legitimate grievances against Republic leadership. On worlds where corruption or neglect had created real suffering, the sight of Jedi lightsabers no longer brought hope but resentment. The moral authority the Order had built over centuries began to crumble in just a few short years of war. All these factors combined to create a perfect storm of vulnerability. The Jedi, spread thin across countless battlefronts, isolated from the ordinary citizens they once served, increasingly divorced from their spiritual foundations, surrounded by troops programmed to kill them, and losing public support by the day, were being systematically positioned for their downfall. The most alarming aspect of this transformation was that the Jedi themselves barely recognized what was happening. The changes occurred gradually, each compromise seeming necessary in the moment, each new military role accepted as a temporary duty. Like the mythical frog in slowly heating water, the Jedi failed to notice the danger until it was too late to escape. Their inability to sense the Sith influence behind the conflict represented the most significant failure of all. For an Order built on perception and insight, this blindness was staggering. Darth Sidious operated literally under their noses, meeting regularly with Jedi Council members, and yet remained undetected. Count Dooku, once one of their own, had fallen to the dark side and become a Sith apprentice without the Council realizing the full truth until years into the war. What explains this failure of perception? The answer lies in the nature of the dark side itself. Fear, anger, aggression, and suffering feed its power. The Clone Wars generated these emotions on a galactic scale, creating a fog that clouded Jedi perception. The war also forced the Jedi to focus outward rather than inward, their attention fixated on military threats, political developments, and tangible enemies. This outward focus prevented them from perceiving the subtle currents in the Force that might have revealed the true nature of the conflict. They were looking for threats beyond the Republic when the greatest danger sat at its very heart. Even those Jedi who sensed something amiss found their concerns dismissed or minimized. The pressure of wartime leadership left little room for careful investigation of vague feelings or troubling inconsistencies. The urgency of the present crisis always took precedence over deeper reflection about its underlying causes. By the time some Jedi began to seriously question the origins and purpose of the war, the trap had nearly closed. The seeds of their destruction had been planted years before and had taken firm root. All traps have a trigger. For 3 long years, the Sith had patiently positioned their pieces across the galactic board. The Republic military machine had expanded beyond recognition. The Jedi Order had been systematically weakened and compromised. Chancellor Palpatine had accumulated powers that transformed his office from a representative leader to a practical dictator. And throughout the galaxy, a vast army of identical soldiers stood ready, waiting for a single command. That command was Order 66. The brilliance of the clone army as a weapon against the Jedi cannot be overstated. From the moment the first battalions deployed on Geonosis, the clones served alongside the Jedi, fought with them, bled with them, and earned their complete trust. Many Jedi developed deep bonds with their clone commanders, viewing them not just as soldiers, but as friends and confidants. Yet each clone carried within them a biological time bomb in the form of an inhibitor chip implanted during their creation on Kamino. These chips represented the pinnacle of Kaminoan bioengineering, merged with Sith foresight. The activation of Order 66 was deceptively simple. A secure communication from Chancellor Palpatine, a brief command that the Jedi had betrayed the Republic, and the statement to execute Order 66. That was all it took. When those words were transmitted across the galaxy, the inhibitor chips activated instantly, overriding the personalities and free will of the clone troopers. Men who moments before had been loyal comrades became emotionless executioners. The war had reached a point where the public was desperate for resolution at any cost, and Palpatine himself had manipulated events to create the appearance of a Jedi assassination attempt against him, providing the pretext for his order. Jedi who had survived years of combat against battle droids fell to blaster fire from behind, cut down by their own troops. The true horror of Order 66 lay in its comprehensiveness. It targeted not just the Jedi generals on the front lines, but all members of the Order. Clone commanders stationed at the Jedi Temple on Coruscant led a full-scale assault on what should have been the safest sanctuary for the Jedi, a place of learning and meditation transformed into a charnel house in the space of a single night. Meanwhile, through an elaborate series of political maneuvers, Palpatine laid the legal groundwork for the complete delegitimization of the Jedi Order. Emergency broadcasts across the Republic announced that the Jedi had attempted a coup against the democratically elected leadership. Evidence was presented, carefully fabricated or manipulated, showing Jedi violence against Republic officials. Most citizens, their understanding of the Jedi already diminished by years of war, accepted this explanation without question. After all, they had grown accustomed to seeing the Jedi as military figures rather than spiritual leaders. The idea that these powerful warriors might seize control out of a desire for power seemed plausible to a population that no longer truly understood what the Jedi represented. The very memory of the Jedi Order as a force for good began to fade from the collective consciousness of the galaxy. For the few Jedi who survived the initial slaughter, the galaxy transformed overnight from a place where they were respected guardians to one where they were hunted fugitives. Their lightsabers, once symbols of justice, became dangerous liabilities that could identify them to Imperial forces. Some fled to the Outer Rim, seeking anonymity on frontier worlds beyond effective Imperial control. Others went into hiding in plain sight, suppressing their Force abilities and adopting civilian identities. A small number attempted to organize resistance, only to discover how thoroughly the clones had executed their orders. Where once thousands of Jedi had maintained peace throughout the galaxy, now only scattered individuals remained, isolated and in hiding. The clone troopers themselves represent another tragic dimension of this betrayal. These men had been created for one purpose, bred for loyalty and conditioned from birth to follow orders without question. After the successful execution of Order 66, the clones found themselves in a changed galaxy as well. The newly christened Empire had little use for an army of identical soldiers now that their primary purpose had been fulfilled. The clones who had been heroes of the Republic, celebrated in propaganda and news broadcasts, quickly became outdated tools. The Empire began phasing them out, replacing them with recruited stormtroopers who had no connection to the Jedi and no memories of serving alongside them. Many clone veterans found themselves destitute, abandoned by the government they had been created to serve. Their accelerated aging meant they had only brief periods to establish civilian lives before physical decline set in. Some became mercenaries or security consultants. Others drifted through the galaxy, struggling with the knowledge of what they had done when the chips took control. A few managed to remove their chips and grapple with the full horrific weight of their actions. The transition from Republic to Empire was presented to the galaxy as the logical conclusion of the Clone Wars rather than its secret purpose. In a speech to the Senate, now Emperor Palpatine characterized the transformation as necessary for security in the wake of Jedi betrayal. The war-weary representatives applauded as he dissolved the very democracy they represented, trading freedom for promises of peace and order after years of devastating conflict. The sheer scale of the deception became clear only in retrospect. The Clone Wars had never been a conflict between the Republic and Separatists with the goal of preserving democracy or achieving independence. From the first battle on Geonosis to the last engagements before Order 66, the entire war had been orchestrated to achieve specific ends. The elimination of the Jedi Order, the transformation of the Republic into the Empire, and the installation of Sith rule over the galaxy. In the aftermath of Order 66, as the last echoes of the Clone Wars faded into silence, the true magnitude of the Sith victory began to take shape. This was not merely a change of leadership or political system. The physical devastation left by 3 years of galactic civil war created the perfect foundation for imperial control. Thousands of worlds had seen their infrastructure destroyed, their economies shattered, their populations traumatized by violence and displacement. Trade routes that had functioned smoothly for centuries lay disrupted. Planetary governments that had maintained independence for generations found themselves crippled and vulnerable. Into this vacuum stepped the Empire, offering immediate solutions to desperate populations. Imperial engineers rebuilt bridges and spaceports. Imperial supply ships delivered food and medicine to starving communities. Imperial peacekeepers restored order to lawless regions where criminal organizations had flourished during the chaos of war. Citizens who might have resisted authoritarian rule in peacetime welcomed it with relief amid the ruins of their former lives. This dependency was not accidental, but carefully engineered. Throughout the Clone Wars, military targets had been selected not just for their tactical value, but for their long-term economic impact. Manufacturing centers, agricultural zones, and trade hubs suffered disproportionate damage compared to targets of purely military significance. With Republic oversight mechanisms dismantled, former separatist corporate assets were seized without due process, bringing vast industrial capacity under direct Imperial control. The massive shipyards of Kuat and Corellia, the mines of Kessel, the factories of Kimoon 1, all transitioned seamlessly from wartime production to building the Imperial war machine. Separatist technology represented another spoil of war. Battle droid designs were studied and adapted for Imperial security forces. Separatist warship innovations were incorporated into Star Destroyer blueprints. Even the feared separatist suppression programs found new applications in controlling restive populations on recently subjugated worlds. The very tools developed to fight against centralized authority became weapons to enforce it. Perhaps most valuable was the military data gathered throughout the conflict. Military strategists gained access to an unparalleled database of tactical information. Effective resistance methods, successful defense strategies, optimal occupation protocols, all documented in exhaustive detail, all available to help crush future opposition. The Clone Wars also provided the Empire with a template for population control through fear and propaganda. Citizens who had lived through years of threat reports, security alerts, and war news had been conditioned to accept surveillance and restrictions as necessary safeguards. The transition from wartime security measures to permanent Imperial monitoring happened so gradually that many barely noticed the shift. For the average citizen, daily life under Imperial rule initially seemed an improvement over the uncertainty of wartime. The credits flowed again. Markets reopened. The constant fear of separatist attack faded into memory. Many willingly traded political freedoms they rarely exercised for security and stability they desperately needed. The Clone Wars had not just exhausted the galaxy physically, but mentally and emotionally as well. The elimination of the Jedi Order removed the most significant potential source of organized resistance to Sith rule. These Force-sensitive guardians had not just been physically powerful individuals, but leaders who could inspire hope and unity. Their connection to the Force gave them insights and abilities that might have detected Imperial plots or inspired successful rebellions. Jedi teachings were banned, their histories rewritten, their temples desecrated or repurposed. Future generations would know the Jedi only as villains in Imperial propaganda, or as mystical figures from children's tales, not as the guardians of peace and justice they had been for 1,000 generations. This cultural genocide was as important to long-term Sith rule as the physical execution of Order 66. Since the time of Darth Bane, the Sith had operated according to the rule of two, patiently building toward the moment when they could reclaim dominion over the galaxy. Each master had trained an apprentice, passing down knowledge and refining strategies across generations. Darth Sidious represented the culmination of this lineage, the Sith Lord, who finally achieved what his predecessors had only dreamed of. By the time the Empire formally rose, Palpatine had a detailed playbook for controlling virtually any world in the galaxy. Looking at the galaxy in the years following the Clone Wars reveals a thoroughly transformed landscape. Political systems that had functioned for centuries had been dismantled. Economic networks had been rewired to funnel resources toward imperial priorities. Cultural institutions had been reprogrammed to serve the new order. Military assets had been repurposed for oppression rather than protection. And behind it all stood the Sith, architects of a conflict designed from its inception to fail in exactly the way that would facilitate their rise to power. This was why the Clone Wars were meant to fail. They succeeded perfectly in their true purpose, transforming a democratic republic into a totalitarian empire, ushering in a dark age that would engulf the galaxy for generations to come.